What if the car that many believe will dominate the new era of Formula One actually hides a huge problem that Mercedes never wanted to admit? Because after the Australian Grand Prix, something has happened that is making the paddock tremble. The Australian Grand Prix not only marked the start of the season, it was also the moment when the narrative around Mercedes began to change. For months, the dominant discourse within the paddock had been quite clear. The W17 project was one of the most advanced of the new technical era of Formula One. There was talk of an extremely innovative car, an aerodynamic concept capable of taking advantage of gray areas in the regulations, and a technical architecture that, on paper, could give Mercedes an enormous advantage over the rest of the teams. But after Australia, Lewis Hamilton began to drop comments that have made many within the paddock look at that story from a completely different perspective. Now from Ferrari, Hamilton has a very particular position. For years he was the central driver of the Mercedes project, someone who experienced every phase of development, every technical problem, and every strategic decision from the inside. Therefore, when he compares his new experience with Ferrari with what he experienced at Mercedes, his words do not sound like a simple external opinion, but rather like a window into what was really happening within the team. And what it has suggested is that the W17 project was surrounded by many more doubts than was publicly admitted. While the image of a team completely confident in its technical concept was projected externally, internally there were questions about the complexity of the car, its real operating window, and how delicate its behavior could be in variable conditions. One of the keys to these statements is in the direct comparison that Hamilton has made between the Ferrari he now drives and the last Mercedes he drove. According to his own insinuations, the Ferrari gives him a feeling of stability and predictability that he did not always find in Brackley's car. In Formula One, that word predictability has enormous weight. A car can be extremely fast in absolute terms, but if its behavior is difficult to anticipate, if it changes too much depending on the circuit, the temperature, or the aerodynamic load, then it becomes a very difficult car to exploit during an entire race weekend. And that is precisely what Hamilton has hinted was happening with the development of the Mercedes project. The interesting thing is that these words come just after the first Grand Prix of the year, when all the teams begin to analyze more clearly where they really are. Australia is always an eye-opening moment because for the first time the cars compete in real racing conditions, away from the hidden preseason programs. And in that context, the fact that Hamilton has begun to indirectly point out the potential weaknesses of the W17 project has caused an immediate reaction within the paddock. Some engineers have begun to wonder if Mercedes really has a huge technical advantage, or if, on the contrary, it has built a car that is extremely fast but too complex to be consistent throughout the season. Because if something characterizes the W17 according to the technical leaks, it is precisely its conceptual aggressiveness. Mercedes would have pushed the limits of the regulation in several key areas, especially in the way the car manages aerodynamic flows under the floor and in the integration of the new hybrid system. On paper, that kind of approach can create a very big advantage if everything works perfectly. But it can also make the car extremely sensitive to small changes in configuration, temperature, or aerodynamic balance. And when Hamilton now talks about cars with very delicate operating windows, many within the paddock interpret that he is describing exactly that type of project. Therefore, what seemed like simply the change of team for one of the greatest drivers in history could be having much deeper consequences. Because Hamilton has not only left Mercedes, is also beginning to offer a different perspective on one of the most important technical projects of the next era of Formula One. And if what he is implying is true, then the W17 could be much more complex and much riskier than the team itself has let on until now. If Lewis Hamilton's words have generated concern in the paddock, it is because behind the W17 project there is an extremely ambitious technical idea. Mercedes was not simply looking to build a fast car for the present, but rather to get ahead of the new technical cycle of Formula One with a concept that, according to many engineers in the paddock, tries to take advantage of one of the most interesting loopholes in the regulations. For months, analyses circulated that described the W17 as a car capable of exploiting in a very particular way the aerodynamic flow under the floor, an area of the car that remains absolutely decisive in generating load without increasing resistance on a straight line. The concept attributed to the team led by James Allison aims to maximize that area with an extremely aggressive architecture, capable of producing a higher downforce differential than its rivals if operated within the correct window. On paper, that idea is exactly the kind of innovation that has historically allowed Mercedes to dominate entire eras of Formula One. The problem is that the more aggressive a concept is, the more difficult it is to integrate it with the rest of the car. And this is where the details that Hamilton knows very well from his time within the team begin to appear. During the development of the W17, leaks emerged that spoke of very basic difficulties in the integration of the new engine with the chassis. These were not just aerodynamic tweaks or small performance issues, but fundamental issues related to the packaging of the mechanical assembly within the monocoque. At some points in the process, startup failures were even mentioned when the entire system was fully assembled, something that in Formula One is usually a clear sign that the project is pushing the limits of engineering to the maximum. These types of difficulties do not necessarily mean that the car is bad. In fact, the exact opposite often happens. The most innovative projects tend to go through much more turbulent development phases than conservative concepts. But they do reveal one important thing. The W17 is not a conventional car. It's a design that depends on an extremely delicate interaction between aerodynamics, chassis structure, and power unit. And when a car is built around that kind of balance, its performance can vary wildly depending on the conditions in which it competes. That's why many paddock engineers interpret Hamilton's words as more than just comparisons between teams. When the Briton talks about extremely fast cars but with very sensitive operating windows, he is describing precisely the type of behavior that usually appears in very radical technical projects. A car like this can seem unbeatable when everything fits together. Tire temperature, aerodynamic balance, hybrid power, and circuit configuration. But when one of those variables moves outside the ideal zone, performance can drop abruptly. That is the real fear that is beginning to appear after Australia. If Mercedes has truly found an aerodynamic concept capable of generating a structural advantage over its rivals, then the W17 could become a benchmark that is impossible to copy during the season. But if that advantage depends on an extremely complex architecture to control, then the car could walk a fine line between absolute dominance and technical inconsistency. And that scenario is precisely what makes Hamilton's statements so important. Because he is not speaking from outside the project. He's speaking as someone who saw how that car came to be, how it was developed, and what kind of challenges appeared in the process. And when a driver with that level of experience hints that a project can be both brilliant and delicate at the same time, the entire paddock starts to pay attention. But the real critical point of the W17 is not only in its aerodynamics or its chassis architecture. The real challenge appears when you analyze the heart of the car, the new power unit. And this is where the technical context of Formula One changes completely compared to what we had seen during the last decade. 4 years, single-seater performance was primarily dominated by the internal combustion engine, with the hybrid system functioning more as a strategic add-on than the core of performance. However, the new generation of engines radically changes that balance and forces teams to completely rethink the way they design their cars. In this new era, the power distribution becomes much more balanced between the heat engine and the electrical system. The 1.6-liter V6 will continue to be a key part, generating around 400 kilowatts of power, but the electrical system will contribute an almost equivalent amount, approximately 350 kilowatts from the MGUK. This means that a huge part of the performance will depend on the management of electrical energy during each lap. It's no longer just about having a powerful engine, but about knowing exactly when to deploy that energy, how to conserve it, and how to integrate it with aerodynamics and race strategy. Adding to this complexity is another fundamental change: the disappearance of the MGUH, the system that in the previous generation recovered energy directly from the turbo. Without that piece, teams must find new ways to manage the energy inside the car, which makes software, power maps, and the efficiency of the hybrid system absolutely decisive factors. In addition, the regulation also reduces the permitted fuel flow, forcing the combustion engine to be much more thermally efficient than before. All of this creates a technical environment in which every detail counts, from the car's aerodynamics to the way energy is distributed on each straight. In a context like this, the integration between chassis, aerodynamics, and power unit becomes one of the most difficult tasks that a team can face. And that is precisely the type of challenge that seems to have accompanied the development of the W17 from its earliest phases. A car designed around such an aggressive concept needs all its parts to work in perfect harmony. If energy management is not exactly right, if aerodynamics does not work within the ideal window, or if engine efficiency is not maintained at expected levels, the entire balance of the car can be compromised. That is why Hamilton's words have resonated so strongly within the paddock. When the Briton talks about the enormous complexity involved in controlling these new hybrid systems and how delicate the behavior of a car built around that architecture can be, many interpret that he is describing exactly the type of challenge that Mercedes has had to face with the W17. A car that can produce spectacular performance figures on paper, but also demands an extremely precise level of technical control to perform consistently over an entire race weekend. And there appears the real dilemma that now worries Mercedes rivals. If the Brackley team has managed to master that technical complexity, then they could have one of the most advanced cars on the grid on their hands. But if that control is still not perfect, the W17 could become a car as brilliant as it is unpredictable. A car capable of appearing invincible in certain conditions, and extremely vulnerable in others. That uncertainty is precisely the reason why, after Australia, all teams are carefully watching every clue that appears about the true behavior of this project. Because Hamilton does not speak as an outside observer. He speaks as someone who experienced the development of the car from the inside, who was part of the technical process and who knows perfectly well the decisions that were made along the way. And what it has revealed is that the W17 was not born as a simple project nor as a perfectly controlled machine from the first moment. It was a car built around an extremely aggressive idea, with a complex architecture that pushed the limits of aerodynamics, chassis packaging and management of the new hybrid system. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.